Corey Branch, Chair of the Transit and Transportation Committee. We have 3 items today on our agenda. 2 of them are basically closely related. But we will start off with our first one, which is the Environmental Advisory Board Annual Report, Energy Use in Transportation.
Thank you, Chairman Branch. Yes, today we've got Megan Anderson from our Sustainability Office. We're going to walk through part of their annual report process here. We did a similar report out in the Growth and Natural Resources Committee on Tuesday, so this will kind of closely follow that, and you may hear some common themes. But Megan is joined by Colleen Sullins from the chair from the Environmental Advisory Board today, and they're going to walk through a quick presentation for you.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Council. One second, let me get this up and loaded here. I'm not sure why it's not letting me. There we go. Excuse me. All right. Well, good to be here with you today. We're excited to share with you the report from the Environmental Advisory Board. So just to get started, I will just remind you of the Environmental Advisory Board, how we got here today. So they came to you in July with their full annual report, and Council then referred the Transportation and Transit Committee to speak about the energy use and transportation part of their annual report. And with that, just as information, that the board has been really good about connecting their work plan to the work of the Community Climate Action Plan, of which transportation and land use is a big piece of that. And so with that, I want to give them a big thank you for that work. I also want to give a big thank you as I invite Colleen to come up to Ben and Colleen, who are our chair and vice chair. They have been with us to lead us through a lot, all through COVID, and a lot of changes as well. So I want to thank them for their leadership. And with that, I'll hand it over to Colleen, and after that, I will come back up for just a few minutes and share a little bit more context on the work that staff has done since they got their report. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to come and make a presentation to you today. As Megan said, I'm the chair of the Environmental Advisory Board, and we are here today to talk about the Energy Use and Transportation Report. Earlier this week, we came to the Growth and Natural Resources and talked about the Energy Use in New and Existing Buildings Report, so there's been a lot of information that we're in the process of presenting out to you. And after I'm done, as Megan said, she's going to come back and talk a little bit about some updates. I would note that this report was actually completed in August of 2021, and the reason it's taken us so long to come before you is we missed the window of time when we were making our presentation in 2021 and getting our new plan our new work plan up to date. And so this report is it's about a year old. So the information may be a little dated, but staff will be providing you with some updates associated with it. With that, I'm going to talk about the information that was presented to the Environmental Advisory Board, and also then what are some identified opportunities and challenges and recommendations that the board had to carry forward to council. So the transportation electrification study, as I'm sure you know, was completed in November of 2019 and looked at the fleet and the the electric vehicle infrastructure, equity and access to EV, equitable economic development associated with EV, and the roles and responsibilities for the staff. We heard from engineering services and the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources. They made presentations. So we looked into the current fleet, what it consists of, the equipment, and initiatives that were underway to transform the transportation sector. Whoops. So I'm going to start with electric vehicles and equipment. We got an understanding of what the policies are surrounding those, the current fleet and assets, the staffing and replacement processes, as well as cross-departmental committees that address these issues. The transportation electrification, the implementation next steps this point are looking at things like EV spatial analysis, and I'm sure a lot of this particular aspect of things has moved forward, but looking at placement and public-private partnership opportunities. Steps that were underway are hardware and software specifications and total costs of ownership and budget integration. The development of an equitable economic deployment strategy is also underway, and then roles and responsibilities for the strategies, actions, priorities, timelines, and alignment with the existing work. And education. Education is always an important component, educating the private development as well as city staff and an infrastructure assessment for fleet deployment. There have been a lot of things that have happened that are going to affect these sorts of things. The ARPA funds that have become available since this report. So there are things that are going on currently that the staff will be able to provide more updates on. So some of the opportunities and challenges that were presented are things like charging stations that are compatible with fully electric and plug-in facilities, plug-in hybrid facilities, providing alternative use information to departments so that they can understand what the usage is and encourage use of alternative fuels. Telematics is apparently a fairly significant portion of this to monitor the assets by GPS and onboard diagnostics that enables that information to be gathered and then can be evaluated to make determinations on what next steps need to be taken. A system to monitor and invoice departments for energy consumption is another key piece of this. And then there are modification challenges such as the North Carolina Accessibility Code, handicap, wider van accessibility parking spaces, and fleet. And there are a series of fleet committees that are cross-departmental that are looking at all of these issues. So with Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources, they have a lot of equipment, and they have a number of challenges that are associated with this equipment going to electric. So there's the issue of charging locations and infrastructure needs is specifically associated with their equipment. With remote locations for their equipment, they'll have needs for charging the infrastructure at multiple locations. Also, the budgetary constraints and considerations, the initial costs of the equipment are higher than conventional, so there's a need to do cost comparison, look at funding options and strategies to leverage purchasing power. Another significant issue is equipment performance. For those of you who do yard work it yourself, you know that the battery on a leaf blower or a weed whacker doesn't last all that long. So there's a performance issue in terms of the timing of how long it takes, how long this equipment will run before it needs to be recharged. So there are weight issues, battery life issues, those kinds of things. And then data management to track operational maintenance costs so that comparisons can be made between the existing fleet and moving it to an alternative and electric fleet. From transportation, we heard about partnerships, both internal and external, Raleigh's bio-recovery project, micromobility, the scooters issues, bike plans, complete streets where we're safely mixing modes of transit, the Wake Transit Plan, Commute Smart Raleigh, and equitable development around transit. These were all issues that we discussed at the Environmental Advisory Board. Some of the opportunities and challenges that exist, the zoning toolkit needs to look at anti-displacement mechanisms and retaining communities in place. So mixed use, smaller developments, a lot of communities that can be impacted when you bring in things like bus rapid transit, some of the development displacement process that can occur. Shifting away from cars also requires advocacy from multiple perspectives. So talking to people about the climate aspect, the economic aspect, public health, and demonstrating those benefits to people. So in essence, getting the word out is an opportunity and a challenge. And education and advocacy for shared streets, the walk, bike, bus, car. I walk around a lot in Raleigh, so I see a lot of this, and there's lots of opportunities around those issues. For our recommendations on the transportation electrification, the infrastructure that needs to increase focus on equitable rollout. So being inclusive of all groups and looking at affordable housing areas and small and minority-owned businesses so that they have access to these charging stations. And the transformation needs to continue of the city fleet, so reviewing the vehicle procurement and replacement processes, creating a process for prioritizing EV and equipment as a first choice are things that can be done. We recommended staff prepare and council approve a roadmap to transform the city fleet to EV and alternative fuels, working with the departments, and to transition relevant equipment, setting goals and targets for EV-ready, EV-capable, or EV installed facilities at the city locations. Community education on best practices is also important, and hopefully Megan will be able to give us an update on the EV-ready playbook. Transportation and land use recommendations. We recommended continued development of strategies to address reducing single occupancy vehicles, vehicle miles traveled, creating walkable, bikeable, mixed use, and mixed income neighborhoods. We also recommended mapping existing and proposed transportation hubs to encourage mixed use, mixed income within a half-mile radius of the hubs, and to look for ways to move forward on more transit-oriented solutions. I know the bus rapid transit is moving forward, commuter rail, expanded bus service, mixed safe transit modalities. And also that staff continue carbon emissions analyses and zoning and area plans, considering the carbon intensiveness of buildings and the relationship to carbon efficient transit. From an equity perspective, we felt that the city needs to continue to look for ways to support options and access and mitigate past environmental impact, and burdens. So I'm going to turn it back over to Megan. She's going to give you a short update on some of the things that have moved forward.
Thank you, Colleen. As you can tell, she's definitely a super volunteer. She used to work for the state, so obviously has a lot of good knowledge to help us think through some of these things. So with that, as she mentioned, I'll just give you a quick overview, and if you have more questions, we've got lots of staff here that can go into more detail if there's anything you want to know in more detail. Whoops, excuse me. So just to get started, I'll give a quick overview and then jump into a couple of these topics a little bit further. So as Colleen mentioned, we had been talking about doing an EV implementation strategy rollout. We're underway on that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but that's going to help us with actually transforming our fleet over the next 10 years. And since then, we've also hired a new vehicle fleet manager who's an expert you've heard from before, Rick Longabart, so he's here if you have any questions about that as well. We've been working on quite a few funding opportunities. We've gotten some electric buses. I know Mayor Pro Tem and I were at an event earlier with the governor, and we had some of our electric buses we've gotten through VW settlement funds and other things earlier this week. Lots of things coming down from the state by the day, by the week, which is exciting around this topic area. So there's a lot of good synergy there, and we keep on top of looking at those opportunities. We are looking at, as was mentioned, some of those challenges. We had looked at buildings and how we were going to put the EV infrastructure in, what that capacity for electrical loads and everything looked like. And with Rick's help, we've come up with some pilots, and we're working towards a model around a motor pool, park and ride kind of situation where we can transform our fleet, starting with motor pools, and then also thinking long-term about where do staff vehicles domicile at night to charge, which also opens up the opportunity for public-private partnerships where daytime charging could happen with the public and nighttime charging could happen with our vehicles. So exciting things. It's just putting all those puzzle pieces together about operations, where folks need to be, how we track it all. It's not rocket science, but it's kind of complex, so we're working that out. Electric grounds maintenance equipment. Colleen went into some detail on some of the challenges with that, but it's also very exciting. I got a picture earlier this week from my counterpart in Durham Ivan in Parks and several staff of Rick's went over and were looking at piloting some robotic electric mowing equipment. So they're really on top of this and looking through all the different things. And really, it's just matchmaking what equipment is ready for that 8-hour-a-day work in the way that we need it and where they can run it in, and then also the upfront costs. So something we continue to look at as well. With the electric buses, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but there's a lot of work, and council's heard quite a bit about our exciting work on that transition, and I'll hold on that for just a minute and talk about it. And then finally, an EV Ready Playbook. Sustainability has been working closely with Advanced Energy, who is funded through the Utilities Commission, has funds that go towards advanced energy from, and then the utilities actually pay into that, and we're working on this playbook that's going to help roll out the standards for EVs across the state, which is pretty exciting. It's specific to Raleigh, but we wrote it in a way that everyone can use it, so it's a good thing that we could be proud of that we're helping go past the state. And we hope to roll that out. We're getting final feedback from all the different partners and hope to roll it out in November. We're probably going to be a roll where we work with some of our partners first and then roll it out to the development community, and then also internally make sure we have our design guidelines in place as well. So there'll be a lot of work happening around that. So with the EV implementation strategy rollout project, these are some of the areas that we're looking at within there. I won't go through all in detail, but happy to talk a little bit more if you'd like to. Several things to look at. I've talked about a few of them over time. Things like total cost of ownership when you think about changing your whole fleet and externally to moving away from gas-powered vehicles. There's just a lot of things that have been built a certain way to do that. So we have to kind of undo that and think about the way that we're going to have those investments happen in the beginning and then have lower costs over time with the total cost of ownership, and where that technology is ready to be taken over as we do our vehicle replacement cycles to be the most sustainable over time. So lots of thoughts going on there. And at the same time, making sure we have the right software, hardware in place for both public and private needs. And then also always thinking about it from a resiliency perspective around disasters and power outages, as well as where we can fit in equity pieces in our own rollout and how that fits in with the public as well. So that'll be something we will be rolling out over the next year, and different pieces are happening right now. So when it comes to transit, there's quite a bit. Council's pretty aware of the work that's happening to roll out the expansion of BRT. I won't go into too much detail, but much more has been happening over time. One point of interest that I know Council's also excited about is the ARPA funding that we got to put the 19 solar stations on top of the bus stop, or the bus stops in certain locations as well. So we're pretty excited about that. We can go into more detail on this rollout if necessary. I know you talk about it quite a bit. In the space for the Go Raleigh bus fleet, they have a goal to convert 75% of that fleet to renewable CNG. We have the 50-plus buses that we're going to be working with the anaerobic digester bioenergy project that we're excited about, 5 electric buses already. And they're already, which is pretty exciting, a 70% low to no emission fleet as of 2023, which is great. And we continue to look at new technologies. It may be that there's other technologies over time past just the electric buses that we'll continue to look at over time to be the most sustainable fleet we can. So that's part of why that goal talks about other advanced technologies. So continue to look at that. And finally, Council is aware of the equitable development around transit plan. There was a guidebook that came out in 2021, and there are several key areas of that focused work that staff continue to work on, including transit overlay districts, and the mapping is completed in some areas and being initiated in others, a height bonus to encourage the affordability and extend it to all frequent transit routes, pedestrian safety, lots of discussions happening there, lots of new staff that have been added to work on safety issues around the city as well, and more specific TOD planning initiated for stations along some of the corridors as well. So with that, we are open to any questions if you have any for staff or for the Environmental Advisory Board chairs, Colleen and Ben.
Definitely thank you for the presentation. I have a couple questions. I don't see if any other council members have any questions. Go ahead.
I've had folks recently ask what we can do to provide more public access for the electric vehicle charging. And so I really liked the idea of trying to find a place where we could charge the city fleet and then also make it available to the public. And so I think that would be something that would be helpful to, as we get more ideas on it, maybe push out, because there's a lot of interest in that.
Good point. And just as we're thinking about this, how we've been thinking of it is the city doesn't want to be in the business of owning all the electric vehicle charging around. And so we're trying to think about leading by example where we have public available facilities or areas. We'd like to make sure we make charging available in those areas as we move forward. And we've done a lot of mapping to look at where the hot spots are going to be around as well. And so with that in mind, how do we have those strategic conversations with the developers and different groups out there? And the things like the EV Ready Playbook are going to help us have those strategic conversations and thinking of areas where folks may not have a chance to charge in the same way if they don't have home charging, such as multifamily, parking on the street. How are we going to fix that as well? So there's a lot of different pieces of this we're thinking about as we move forward. And there's a lot of different groups that have opportunities to give charging. We just want to make sure that it works so we can actually get the data and information we need and set the standards we want as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have a follow-up. On the heat map for areas where we could use the EV charging, are we able to sort of tie that in to the rezoning cases that come before us? Like, when does that get flagged for discussion?
That's a good point. Actually, I think that's something we're still trying to develop, how to use that map and where we've had discussions just around something like that. So I think that's a good point that we can take back as staff as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So you touched on this when you were talking about EV buses, but I think it applies all over, and this technology is all changing so fast. And we want to be a leader. We should be a leader. This is the good thing to do if we can work through some of the challenges. I'm just interested in hearing, how do you, I guess, strike a balance? What are your thoughts about, we don't want to adopt new technologies too fast in a fast-changing market because we may end up spending a lot more than we had to get the job done. So how do you approach that problem when you think about this?
That's a great question. Just today, we were talking about this a little bit as an example. So to be good stewards of money in the government, we were thinking about, for example, for EVs, really best practices as we have new facilities is to make sure that conduit's in the ground, we have the electrical capacity, so no matter what kind of technology's out there, we can plug it in over time. And so if we can make sure we think of those foundational steps, whether it's the community, the development community, or ourselves, to make sure that when we think a building or a facility is going to be around for at least 50 years, they're going to need that conduit in the ground. And that's a good investment no matter what the technology is you overlay on the top. And the technologies over time, those will need to be replaced over a life cycle. And so I feel like we're in a good place to kind of think of that strategically to make sure we have that foundation. If you're talking about the buses, I would probably ask David to give you a little bit more information on what he's learning, on where that is. But you do hear about it a lot, and I know David knows quite a bit, if you want to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, let's hear about the bus.
Okay.
That's what we're here for.
Good afternoon, David Eatman, Transportation. I would say from Transit's perspective, we have 5 electric buses currently. We just installed charging stations for up to 14. So we do plan growth around our electric fleet. And it is a journey. I mean, it's a learning process, as you stated. I don't think that, there are agencies that have very bold projections that we're going to be all electric by this particular date. We have not done that per se, but we do know that the industry is turning electric, and so we must learn as we move forward through that process. And so we've tried to match that, I guess, learning curve with our operational needs. And, obviously that's number one. Our passengers need reliability, and we want to make sure that's there. But trying to push that envelope a little bit, getting us out of our comfort zone and really trying to push that technology. That's probably a little bit vague, but that's the best that we got at the moment.
All right. Definitely, thank you. A couple questions, David, don't go far. I'll start with you first. I'll be nice. You say you have for 14 stations. Are all of those at the location on Pool Road, or what are you doing what's the plan to have stations that aren't just at the main bus depot? Because it hurts to have a bus, you're going and all of a sudden, hey, we need to recharge it. And because I understand the batteries don't last as long as if we fill up a tank of gas or a tank of.
You're correct. It takes 3 electric buses to cover the same range as 2, CNG buses. So those are the operational, mission critical types of things that we have to think about. We have to make sure we deploy those correctly. The reality is, though, is that the industry is actually going towards a 250-mile range bus. And when we reach that 250 mark, then we can deploy a bus just like we can a CNG bus or a diesel bus. Okay. We're not there yet. We're probably about 60 to 70% there. But it's just getting better every year. So again, we're trying to make sure that we have the as Megan stated, we're trying to make sure we have the infrastructure in place and that we're thinking ahead, not only for our bus fleet, but we're also doing that for our park and rides as well, providing public infrastructure because as people park and ride in the future, they're going to be driving electric vehicles.
Okay, thank you. And I think the rest of this is for Megan, our staff. Going electric pulls a strain on their grid. Mm-hmm. So are we in conversations with Duke Energy to make sure that as we increase our pull on electric, that we're not harming or hurting? Like, I don't want us to go so fast that all of a sudden now I have people calling us because power's out because we're having brownouts. So where's that conversation as far as supporting the overall infrastructure?
Yeah, so Duke Energy is really thinking this is, I think, is an opportunity and a challenge at the same time. And so there's a lot of conversations happening, and it's actually years ago they started calling us and asking us what our EV infrastructure looked like because they were really trying to get ahead of this curve, knowing that it was coming. And to your point, I think the nice thing is that there's a lot of technology out there where I think it's closer to 100%, 97% of charging happens at home at night. Rick could give me the right statistic there. It's right around there. So that's a trickle charge at night. When folks should be asleep, they should have already done the things at night where usually the electrical capacity goes quite up. So there's a lot about technology that needs to be put in place. There's a lot of different pieces to put together. And Duke also, because it is a source of being able to also create that infrastructure, is really in the market of putting that out. So there's a lot of programs that they have on rolling out EV infrastructure, and they've been a partner on an EV Ready playbook, and a lot of conversations that are happening at the state level. The governor has pushed out a lot of EV goals for North Carolina in particular, and we're really ahead of the game, I think, in some ways here in Raleigh, and so we're a big partner in that as well. So I can't speak to all the details of that, but they are definitely really thinking a lot about it and thinking of it as an opportunity and a challenge. And I did want to also call out a good example of a question that just came before on technology to our, in particular, Rick and I have been on the calls quite a bit with our fire chief and fire chiefs. They're really excited about things like electric fire trucks, which are pretty new, and you see a couple popping up around, and it's a very different kind of work that they do. And so those kind of situations are we're figuring them out as the technology changes over time, but are really paying close attention. And I would just want to give a shout out to staff across the groups we're almost, the ideas are coming faster than we can figure them out, but we're trying to figure them out. So it's pretty exciting times.
Got you. Perfect. My last question is, we're doing this in a way that I know we have different brands of electrical vehicles. So it wouldn't matter if someone comes up in a car or a truck. Buses are different, but it doesn't matter what type of vehicle. Anyone could use the same charging station.
That is actually a great question. So depending on the brand, so some groups, not to call it any over another, but that's why we're trying to figure out what we're doing. So there's open protocol software, and I might ask Rick if he wants to come up and share a little bit more about this because he can tell you in more detail. We're looking at making sure our charging stations are open and available to anyone, any kind of vehicle, and there's different levels where you can have the trickle slower charge or a faster charge. And I think a lot of those groups out there that have chargers that only work for one type of vehicle are realizing that if they really want to be in the game in certain ways, they're going to have to open that back up, and those are the conversations we're having too.
Okay. I'll say you and I could have a very detail. I'm an electrical engineer, so we could go very long, and I don't want to hold everyone too much in the weeds. But we do have one more question here.
Thank you. I want to thank our EAB members for being here. Y'all have done a lot of work, and you've also done a lot of work this week coming to present to us, having been at EAB earlier this week. I do want to reference a point y'all made earlier in the presentation. It almost feels, it could be taken that some of your solutions could be in conflict. So you were referencing that we need to be thoughtful about anti-displacement as we're doing BRT, and then also recommending that we do BRT. And I think that one way we look at that is that it's in conflict, but I think another way to look at that is to look at the nuance. And I think staff has brought us down that road. I do want to give some credit to our past council member, which some folks are going to roll their eyes at, but our past council member, Russ Stevenson, for bringing equitable development around transit to the table and bringing us down that road. And I do want to make sure that this council and the future council and our staff continue to look at stabilization planning, which is something we've started to talk about, and continuing that work, because I think that's where we're really going to get into some of those solutions that we want to build as we continue to build a more equitable city, is really getting into that nuance of how we do that. So I just wanted to draw some attention to that, say I see it, and thank you. So that's all. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I think this was reported as information, or I guess we'll report it out as received. And
Yes, sir.
okay. Is there-
I was going to raise that, so we.
yeah.
Yes, that we did that Tuesday on the other ones too. Yep.
So is there a motion from someone?
I'll move to report this item out with no action.
It's been moved and properly second to report out with no action. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed have the same right. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Next, I'll let you.
Certainly.
What's next?
So, thank you, Mr. Branch. So next, we've got two items. We'll take the more transportation-focused item first, but we have two items that are related around the North Hills assemblage. And if you recall, back in September, we had presentation around the Six Forks Road project, and there were a number of questions that came out of that. There were some questions about the applicability of roundabouts in the corridor, and could that be a savings in terms of real estate and footprint and operations. We had a question a little bit about what would happen along on Lassiter Mill, and then just some general questions about the corridor in general and future planning for the part south of I-40. Kenneth Ritchie from Transportation is here today. He's got a presentation that we'll walk through just to remind folks of kind of some of that previous conversation, but also to report out on the other items. And then following that, we actually have the zoning item that was part of that, the Z6721, that we'll get into a little bit, but we'll take this one, the more transportation-focused item first.
Good afternoon, councilors. Hope everybody's having a good day. Kenneth Ritchie with Transportation, here to provide a follow-up on the Six Forks Road. As you will recall, we did provide some of this information during the September 20th meeting. This was a request to kind of look at some of the potential future improvements from the Rowan Street intersection south along the Six Forks corridor, and certainly as it relates to and overlaps with the North Hills area. As a reminder from the Six Forks Road corridor study, that corridor broke the improvements up into three sections. The first section, Lynn to Rowan Street, that section is the project that is currently under design, and we will look at a timeline for that project here in just a minute. Phase 2 looks at Rowan Street to the I-440 interchange, and then 3 kind of looked at some I-440 interchange improvements, noting that the first phase was really kind of a city-focused effort. The second section, a kind of joint effort between city and private development, and then certainly the third, potential joint efforts between NCDOT and the city. So just a little bit of the funding history as it relates to the Six Forks Road corridor. In 2012, the corridor visiting session kind of kicked off. As part of the FY14 budget, there was $150,000 that was appropriated to kick off the corridor study effort. In FY17, so in the summer of 2016, there was $1.85 million that was appropriated to kick off design for the Six Forks Road project. For design in anticipation of the corridor study completing and moving into design. In June 2018, the corridor study was adopted by council. With FY20, there was $9.5 million that was appropriated. That was for real estate and utilities. As part of FY21, the remaining $20 million from the original $31.4 million was appropriated to fund construction. And then most recently, as part of FY23, the result of conversations during the budget process, there was $14.7 million that was reallocated from some other efforts where construction was deferred to future bond consideration to help close a projected funding gap on the existing project. So this is a timeline of the project schedule, and this was presented to you back in July when we did the project update and the condemnation authorization action. Back in October 2020, we had our kind of pre-design touch point where we really re-engaged with the community in terms of the focus being on the first phase of the corridor delivery. September, October 2021, we were out to the public again, now with a more fine-tuned design, starting to show some of the impacts of the project as it relates to easement and property right needs. In May 22, the 65% design was finalized, and then certainly in July we were before you to provide that update, and at that meeting you did authorize the project for condemnation, which did kick off our real estate process. We anticipate completing that real estate in the fall of 23, with bidding to occur the very beginning of calendar year 2024, starting construction in the spring of 24 and looking to complete that summer of 2026. During the 920 presentation, there was a reference made to a proposal that had been received by council from a stakeholder along the corridor as it related to potential introduction of roundabouts through the Rowan-to-Lynn corridor. Certainly looking at a potential of trying to limit some of the property impacts as it relates to the longitudinal along the straighter portions of the road. And certainly noting that there are some who believe that roundabouts gain efficiency in terms of traffic operations. Certainly there's no argument in terms of situational operational efficiencies that roundabouts can bring. Part of the challenge you've got with a corridor like Six Forks, one is going to be the capacity. The volumes on Six Forks, the comp plan would set a cap of about 35,000 vehicles per day for a 4-lane divided. That next step up would be a 6-lane divided. Based off the traffic analysis that was done as part of this Six Forks Road design effort, the average there is about 50,000 cars per day. So certainly trying to move 50,000 cars through a 4-lane could be challenging. Additionally, with regards to coordination with NCDOT, we have talked with them about this proposal. The concern they've got is even a dual lane roundabout probably maxes out at about 40,000 cars per day. And so there was that concern that was raised from DOT that is shared with the city as it relates to the introduction of roundabouts along this corridor. As part of that proposal, I know that there were a couple examples that were presented. There was one for Carmel, Indiana, and one from Clearwater, Florida. The Clearwater, Florida one, obviously based off the singular roundabout, I know that there were some volume projections of upwards of 60,000 vehicles per day that could be carried by that roundabout. Certainly that is a single roundabout situation that's fed in by that really is fed coming across a body of water by a long stretch of road that doesn't have a lot of intersecting streets. And in this situation with Six Forks, a little bit different than that one, having the number of intersections along this corridor and looking at the number of introductions of roundabouts we'd have to have along that corridor also brings into the challenge the congestion that may not be alleviated by simply introducing roundabouts into that situation, nor the ability to really squeeze the street section as I think was hoped to be with the proposal. Certainly we appreciate the involvement from those stakeholders and the time they took to look at that. And certainly we have discussed this and discussed with DOT, but certainly there are challenges there as it relates to capacity. Property impacts is another. Certainly I think that in the proposal, if you could get it down to 4 lanes, it does shrink the impacts along the longer parts of the corridor. But what it does do is it does increase the impacts along at the intersections themselves. The visual shown here kind of shows about a 300-foot impact area. So we looked at the footprint for the examples that were provided, and then also had to look at what potential property rights would be needed to actually construct this. And so and this 300 feet is likely just at a 2-lane roundabout scenario. Given the feedback and conversation with DOT, there's a thought that it may take a larger roundabout than 2 lanes if we were to look at that. And so this impact actually could potentially be bigger than this. And certainly along this corridor, you probably would look at all 4 corners of all the intersections that you would consider roundabouts at potentially being total takes with the introduction of roundabouts. And then multimodal safety. Part of the challenge you've got when you start adding additional lanes to a roundabout, one, it does slow traffic down, but it does create additional conflict points for bikes and pedestrians to be able to navigate through. And so certainly that is a challenge that we would not necessarily recommend in this scenario. Part of what the separated facilities and the intersection designs are really trying to enhance the pedestrian and bicycle experience along Six Forks Road, and adding additional conflict points based off of a multi-lane roundabout scenario likely create some challenges that offset some of the goals of the project itself. So now we'll look at the sections of Six Forks from the termination of the Phase 1 project at Rowan Street South. As just a reminder, Six Forks is classified as an Avenue 6-lane divided along this section from Rowan really down to Computer Drive, so through the interchange, and then it does transition from a 6-lane down to an Avenue 4-lane divided for the remainder of the corridor. We do today have this section in place along the corridor. There are some medians along the 6-lane section as we move towards the interchange. On the 4-lane section south of the interchange, there is a 4-lane divided section there today. It is a center turn lane, not a median divided section. So certainly that's a consideration that we'll talk through here in a minute. And we certainly do not have the separated facilities that would be prescribed with the text change from last year that standardized the separated bike and ped facilities for all street sections of 2 lanes and above. So looking at the potential improvements along the southern section of Six Forks Road, from Moran to Dartmouth, it is an Avenue 6-lane. Existing today, there are 6 lanes and sidewalks. This is about a 1/4 of a mile stretch. The improvements we'd be looking at, trying to look at a raised median, additional multimodal facilities, restriping and resurfacing, trying to use the footprint we've got and try and get a median in there. We estimate that cost to be somewhere between $5 and $10 million. From Dartmouth to Computer Drive, and this does encompass the interchange, there are existing today 6 lanes. There is a raised median through the interchange, and there are sidewalks. With this, we would look at the introduction of multimodal facilities and likely bridge structure enhancements, which could potentially be replacement of the bridge. We estimate that to be in the $15 to $20 million range. And then from Computer Drive, coming out of the interchange down to Atlantic Avenue, the 4-lane divided section, we do have the 4 lanes. We do have a center turn lane and sidewalks. We do not have sidewalks on both sides of that section. We would look at a raised median, multimodal facilities, likely restriping and resurfacing, and we would estimate that 1.6 mile section to be between $45 and $55 million. Certainly these numbers are up to change, as we have noted, as I think has been experienced pretty readily throughout with the construction market as of today, but certainly some estimates in terms of what the cost of those improvements could be. Also at that September 20th presentation, there was a follow-up request regarding Lassiter Mill Road and potential improvements along there. My apologies. Looking at that section that runs from the I-4, or the bridge up to Six Forks Road, today, so it's classified as Avenue 2-lane divided. It exists today as an Avenue 2-lane divided. There's a center turn lane through that section, and there are sidewalks on both sides of the street. That is consistent with the pre-TC 321 street section. Certainly, in terms of improvements we would see in this area would be the potential of introduction of separated facilities. We are looking at the installation of separated facilities along the frontage up to Lassiter at North Hills Avenue as part of the JCPenney redevelopment. The separated facilities are also one of the conditions that are part of Z6721 that would continue those up to Six Forks Road. And certainly with any site plans that would come in this area, the site plan specific TIAs could identify potential other improvements such as turn lanes that may be necessary based off the traffic, both existing and with the proposed development. So that is all that I have right now, but certainly I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions?
So I have a question. Start where you ended, because I think this has been confusing to a lot of people. So the development project we're about to talk about eventually will maybe possibly come to site plan when they're ready, and there'll be a traffic impact analysis at that point.
Correct.
And that's the point when decisions will be made about requiring additional lanes. You suggested turn lanes. I think it's also been suggested to me maybe another lane to entrance ramp lane onto 440. Is all of that on the table when we get to site plan? Can you just kind of detail that process and how it works and what the possible outcomes might be?
So certainly when you go through the site plan process, obviously there's a much more specific proposal that is put in front of staff for review as it relates to height, density, traffic assignments or trip assignments, things like that that have to be considered and then looked at within the context of the regional model and not only existing development but also other development proposals in the area to try and look at what would be necessary to support the trips that are there. Certainly some of those mitigations you historically would see would be additional laneage to try and reduce potential queues or additional laneage to try and move cars through more efficiently. Could be additional, not just turn lanes, but additional laneage in general. Traffic signal upgrades or modifications could be another outcome of those TIAs in terms of looking at timing or necessary changes to help optimize the movement of in these scenarios, not only vehicles, but bikes and peds safely through these different areas.
So you said it would take into account the proposed development that was in site plan and potential future development.
So when I say potential future development, it also looks at any other developments that are already kind of if there's other zoning cases that may be out there or other site plans that may not be built out, it does look kind of within the area what all of that feeds into when you look, because the TIA would really be scoped to look at intersections and street segments that feed in that the development would feed into and how that plays into the overall network in that area.
Okay, so that would avoid, so that would, I mean, the goal, I hope, would be to avoid a situation where, let's suppose, a parcel closest to the Beltline along Six Forks redevelops and no additional laneage is required, and then more northern parcels redevelop, and all of a sudden we realize we should have required an additional lane. All that gets captured in the TIA and site plan analysis?
Yes, based off of information that we have at the time. So certainly what you wouldn't be able to project is, are there going to be future rezonings north of that could feed into it, but based off the zoning information for undeveloped parcels or existing developed parcels based off of their intensity of use, all that information would feed into the analysis that's completed.
And just a follow-up on that, but if something later does come along and there is some improvements that are required, they will have to go back and fix. Basically, they will have to pay for all of it to make sure that they meet the requirements of improvement.
Typically, yes. I mean, typically that TIA based off of is going to dictate what they're going to need to support the level of development that they're proposing.
Okay. Any other questions on this?
Can we go back a couple slides to the three? Yes, that one. So these are the estimated costs. I'm curious where we're at in approving this, because I have real hesitation about moving forward with the final computer drive to Atlantic Ave. So is that an actual reality we're heading that way, or is this just here's some options?
So no, these are just some considerations that we would look at in terms of trying, especially for the Rowan to computer drive section. We look at what the corridor study kind of envisioned, and this is what it would be to finish out the corridor study. The southern section was really just looking at what improvements could be considered if there was concern there. And I mean, really, I think the biggest change would be the introduction of the separated facilities and potentially a median. But none of these have been programmed. This
Okay.
was just information for based off of follow-up response or request.
Great, thank you.
And also, if we were to do that, we would have to do a whole new study. Is that right? To do from computer to Atlantic. Would that be was it ever studied? Will we have to do?
So that section was not included in the corridor study.
Correct.
So certainly, yes. We could look at improvements within the context of the existing prescription, which is the 4-lane divided, but certainly it could behoove us to look at a study of that area.
Right. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that would be probably a precursor to that. Yes.
I'm not advocating either. I'm flagging the fact that we have multiple sort of urban cores developing. Obviously, downtown, North Hills, Midtown area has developed into an urban core. And much of that work was decided before I think any of us got to this table. And now you have this ironwork district kind of in between, and that is right at Atlantic. And so if we want to make it easier to get around our developing dense urban areas, I do think councils moving forward are going to have to look at how we can invest in the necessary infrastructure to get folks from downtown to Ironworks to Midtown without having to use their cars or by bike or other ways. And so I think that this is coming, and it needs to be on the radar.
Could I chime in here? Thank you both for those comments, and especially Councilmember Stewart for raising that question. I'll just offer my perspective. I think the section computer drive to Atlantic is the part that is most ripe for redevelopment, and is the place that I see is probably best positioned for the city to wait and see what that redevelopment is. There's the old Kroger shopping center. There's the shopping center on the north side of Six Forks, east of Wake Forest. So I think there's lots of opportunities along that corridor to lean on the private sector to deliver some of the infrastructure we need. Rowan to computer is a little bit of a different case, I think. I think we know we're going to need some help from the private sector, and we'll get it on parts of it. But I'd really like to see us start getting serious about this section of Six Forks being in the next transportation bond. And if the committee's amenable to making that recommendation that this area be a priority in the next transportation bond, to your point, Councilor Melton, someone else is going to have to finish this job. I hope you'll be around to finish the job. If you are, I'm counting on you. You too, Mr. Branch. But that is a long-term play. But that is something I would like to see as an outcome of our meeting today, is an expression of the need and the priority that this part of Six Forks should get.
Okay. So I figure before we make any decisions here, let's hear the next case and kind of go from there.
So, Mr. Branch, next case up is actually kind of a revisit on our rezoning Z6721. We've got members from city staff here. Travis Crane will be here to kind of do a little revisit and reset to kind of refresh everybody's memory. And then we do have members from the development team here today as well to answer questions. And
Actually, real quick before I move on, is there anyone here from the public that wanted to speak on the first two items that we've addressed? Okay, I just want to make sure before I move to this one. Okay.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, Travis Crane, Planning and Development. So I want to bring you back into the headspace that is Z6721. Y'all have seen this once before. It's about 11 acres of property, currently zoned CX, various heights right now, 5 stories, 12 stories. Request is to rezone to 12 stories urban limited, 30 stories urban limited, and 40 stories urban limited, respectively. So as is the case with all zoning cases, this went through Planning Commission review. They recommend approval 4-1. This has been deemed consistent with the future land use map, the urban form map, and comprehensive plan overall. So to reset the table, this was presented at public hearing on July 5th. The public hearing remains open, and that's just critical to keep in mind as we talk about changes to this application as it moves forward. Conditions were amended prior to the August 16th City Council meeting. You had some discussions at your last committee meeting where this was discussed about additional conditions as well, and the revisions that were presented at the August 16th meeting were really the result of work from city staff and the applicants working together to get some of the wording right. So let's look at the sites specifically, and there are a couple of different sites here. They're called out by node in the conditions, and that's important to remember. I'll start down here south. We've got the 440 node. We've got these couple parcels here known as the Six Forks mode, so that's right at Lasseter Mill, and then Six Forks. And then you've got this one disjointed parcel over here. It's disconnected like Chrissy's arm might be in Stranger Things. So since you've seen this, the conditions have changed somewhat, and I'm going to walk through how they've changed. Where you see underlined language, there's no change here. So we'll start with condition 6. There was some alteration to the condition that speaks to the dedication of land and accommodation for the existing fire station that's there, number 9. There was some change to the condition about how tall a building might be at the 440 node and a potential step back that would happen with a building. And then another condition about step back for the Lasseter node. And this condition here is newer. So what you last saw at the last committee meeting was a commitment to smaller units. They were deemed micro units. Applicant has been in discussions about modifying that condition to then really bring forward an affordability component to the condition. And it was similar to a case that we saw very recently with Z4521. So applicant has been in discussions about that. So looking at the future land use map, this area is shown as regional mixed use. CX zoning is consistent with that. However, the heights of 30 and 40 stories do not align with the guidance that's contained within Table LU2 in the comprehensive plan. And it's also outside of the guidance for the walkable Midtown plan, which each speak to a maximum of 20 stories. So as I mentioned, this has been deemed consistent with the comprehensive plan, consistent with the future land use map of regional mixed use, and consistent with urban form map within the plan. There are a number of land use policies that were analyzed and found to be consistent. a number of additional policies in economic development and environmental protection as well. And then because there is a Midtown plan here that's analyzed during staff review, and staff has found some policies there to be consistent. There are some inconsistent policies that have been identified. I would imagine this is where conversation continues around this request. I would note that affordability here could be reanalyzed, provided that there are additional conditions that are offered that really speak to that condition. So I would just keep an eye on that policy. Same thing with the height, if there were any change there that could alter the staff analysis with respect to those two policies. So just again, to reset, public hearing is still open. So what that means is any conditions can be amended. They must be made more restrictive than the conditions that are in place today. There is no time limit on making those modifications as long as the public hearing is open. So just remember that once the hearing is closed by the City Council, there's a 30-day window to make changes to the zoning conditions. So as long as the hearing remains open, the clock does not start. And then staff must review those conditions 10 days in advance prior to any council action on those conditions. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I cannot find my notes from the prior times we discussed this case, so what I'm maybe asking is probably redundant. But I have two questions. On the inconsistent policies, it says affordability. My recollection of the small area plan here is that 10% of the additional units have to be affordable at 80% AMI for 10 years. So aren't they copying the small, they've lifted that from the small area plan, is that right?
So that's correct. So your remembrance of the way the small area plan speaks to affordability is correct.
So they're following the small area plan.
So that's, I think, the conversation related to that condition about affordability, I think, is moving in that direction, right? So the latest language that you saw was a term of 10-year affordability at 80% AMI for 10% of units above the existing entitlement.
But so why is affordability still listed as an inconsistent policy?
Well, again, I think that's how the staff report was written when it was last in front of you, so I can see.
Before this recent condition.
Right.
So if this recent condition is added that is literally
that
copied from the
comes
small
off.
area plan, then that inconsistent policy would come off.
That's correct.
And then the other question I have is, on the slide where it talks about future land use, it says requested 30 and 40-story height exceed guidance in the walkable Midtown plan. My recollection from the small area plan is that they recommend the 20-story cap, but then it goes on to say that if it's greater than 20 stories, it should be negotiated for substantial community benefits.
That's correct.
So what council will have to decide at the time it is to vote on this case is they're asking for more than 20 stories, is what they're conditioning for the fire station, some other things, is that substantial community benefit. But I'm confused why, so we have a walkable Midtown plan that offers different height guidance than the small area plan?
No, the walkable Midtown plan is the small area plan, so that they're one and the same.
But this is saying it's not consistent. But
So-
technically the small area plan says if it's above 20 stories, do it if they offer something else,
With
basically.
significant community benefit, right? And I think that staff flags that policy for the council's attention, because at that point, it really does become a question of policy that's best answered by the city council.
Understood.
Yeah.
I guess there's just been so much talk about the small area plan, and I think it's important to look at what the community actually negotiated. And what they actually negotiated was 10% of the units need to be affordable, 80% AMI for 10 years. And they negotiated that if it's greater than 20 stories, give us something in return.
Right.
And so that's what the council will have to think about.
Right.
Okay.
Any other questions before I ask the applicant to come up?
Maybe just a comment. I think that was a really good point, Mr. Melton. And I was a part of the small area plan through virtually the entire thing. And I think one of the challenging things about this case is, in an ideal world, we'd have had that in front of us as a community group, and we'd been able to talk about those trade-offs. It wasn't. We don't know what the group would have said. Another thing to keep in mind about the Walkable Midtown Plan is it was a consensus-based process. So what's in that plan got the support of a supermajority of the people who voluntarily showed up. My recollection is upwards of 75, 80%. It was a high threshold for consensus. And we're in a different situation now with a more specific proposal in front of us. And if they choose to propose that affordability condition, then we are just down to one inconsistency with the trade-off of a Midtown transfer station located in the most ideal spot that it could. So things are developing, and things are changing quickly, and the Walkable Midtown Plan, as good as I think it is, in many, many ways, it is already being outpaced by the pace of growth as it goes with small area plans. It doesn't take long in a city that's growing this fast for the recommendations and considerations to become out of date.
Definitely, thank you for those comments. I'd like the applicant to come up and address the concerns around affordability, as well as, I think, the height. Back to the statements that Councilman Buffkin just made concerning the transit center and the height in that area. And how this all impacts traffic.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Jamie Schwedler with Parker Pote, 301 Fayetteville Street. I think the discussion around affordability was heard, and we really went back and looked at that Midtown plan and what the policy said. And so, although that condition's not part of the case yet because we haven't submitted signed conditions, we did submit one that follows the plan exactly, that gives the recommendation from the Midtown plan of whatever entitlements, 10% over the existing entitlements would have that commitment to the 80% AMI for 10 years. So we're trying to nail that right down the fairway to make sure we're lining up with the council's expectations as well as the communities, and are prepared to make that an official part of the case if the committee and council would support that. With respect to building height and timing with the infrastructure, a lot of what we heard, I think there was a lot of support for affordable housing in this location because it was combined with the transit center, and because we're talking about putting transit in the densest part of the site, or the site that has the greatest height. And then the flip side of that was, because this area is the only area designated for 40 stories, and because we have these other improvements going along Six Forks, is there something else that we could do to bring that kind of closer in line with community expectations? We do submit, and we've talked about this before, that the community, the significant public benefits do offset the policy in the plan, and we do think that hits it kind of squarely from a policy perspective. But again, responding to the community, we'd be prepared to offer conditions that do relate to the Six Forks node, because that's where I think we're hearing a lot of the guidance of the community's, I guess, discomfort in terms of the intensity there. And so we would be willing to entertain kind of bringing down the height average in the Six Forks node, as well as kind of timing our first building permit to a date certain. We wouldn't submit a building permit for 3 years or what have you, so that we give time for these improvements to take place. We do have some of that drafted, and we're happy to hand that up to for the committee to review. It's not been formally submitted to the city. It's not an official condition, but it could help to have that in front of you for discussion purposes, if that would be helpful.
So I think so, but my question around the height average, is that based on existing infrastructure plus new, or is that based on only new?
Let me, if I could hand those up.
Okay.
So the condition you'll see, number 9, is the affordable housing one. The condition 10 we've done in track changes is what we were thinking of in terms of the average building height. I'll wait till everyone's got a copy. Thank you, Patrick. So the way that we've written it would be that the average building height in the Six Forks node should not exceed 37.5 stories, and that would be calculated at basically at each site plan that's submitted by averaging the height of the proposed buildings in that site plan with the existing buildings remaining in the node. And the reason we draft it that way is that today there are existing tenants in place for the Six Forks node. There's the Exxon parcel, there's North State Bank, and it's not clear that the entire parcel would develop at the same time. And it's entirely possible that some of those existing buildings might stay for a portion in the future. And a lot of that, of course, depends on what the future of this transit center looks like, where it goes, and the timing of that as well. And so what we thought this could do is leave room for, there might only be one tower there for some time while the others remain in place. Or if it all develops together in terms of the transit center and the entire node together, the entire average at that point would only be 37 and a half stories. But either way, you'd be doing something less than 40 stories for the entire block at full build out.
So I don't know how 37.5 came about, but my question then is, if you build a building based on your current existing buildings, and one of your current existing buildings is removed, case in point, if we're talking about putting in a transit center there, I think one of the conversations was putting it on off of Lassiter to help the buses come in and out, where there's a gas station there. So you can't put a transit center in a gas station. To me, that doesn't make sense. Technically, you can build it, but I'm just saying it doesn't make sense. So if that building is then removed, then it doesn't count towards average anymore.
Correct.
So how do you?
How
do you, for your next future buildings, is it a recalibration of height? Like how? Because it seems like it's a floating number. Because then I'm just trying to make it make sense.
Right. I mean, it would depend on what you're developing. So if we take the Exxon example, the Exxon building itself would go away, and let's say that that's where the transit center would be. And let's just further the example with the transit centers combined with other buildings there, and together it's a mixed-use building that's 40 stories. That would be average with whatever remaining existing structures were there, the North State Bank and other structures. And so you could do perhaps one 40-story building. But then the next site plan you'd submit for the eventual redevelopment of the rest of the Six Forks would have to be coming down in height to reach that average of 37 and a half. So it would depend on how many buildings you have and how many site plans you have. But if you basically went the full 40 stories early, you'd have to then come in with later site plans with shorter buildings over time. And the reason that we think that makes sense is we've heard numbers kind of tossed around. And for the life of this case, putting the transit center in that area and now adding affordable housing, we really want to make sure we have the ability to go 40 stories if it would mean we could accommodate affordable housing and transit center kind of all in the same building. We don't really want to tie the city's hands in what its ultimate plans are for that center. So it still would allow a 40-story building, but then the future development and the remainder of that Six Forks node would have to be something less than in order to get down to that maximum of 37 and a half. That average could end up being, lower just depending on what's ultimately done with the transit center. But again, we want to make sure the city has the full availability of going to that 40 stories if it needs to in order to accommodate those public benefits.
So from that standpoint, from a height standpoint, I'm understanding a little bit. But when we start talking about the TIA part that would be required at supposedly site plan, are you committed to doing that? Site plan, that TIA?
Yes, we would be required to do that under the UDO.
Okay. So when you do that, then that also impacts your height.
It could. There's a provision in the UDO that essentially looks at levels of service and resulting levels of service depending on your specific use and combination of square footages. And there's mechanisms built into the UDO that only allow you to essentially develop as much as is tolerable by the infrastructure. And so there's existing mechanisms in place that the city will have at site plan, depending on exactly what we submit, including with the transit center and its own plans for the transit center, to say this is kind of what the site can tolerate and the resulting improvements. And then that would come with each sequential site plan where they're to be revisited again.
Okay, because it is possible to have it do your TIA. Say your first building's 40 stories. You could do your TIA, but say you're doing office in that building, and based on density and uses, you would probably have to come down 40 stories in order to meet the TIA.
The transportation staff would look at levels of service and make recommendations based on the TIA and its recommendations on timing. And that was what Mr. Ritchie was talking about with respect to taking in the background traffic at other areas. So all of that would be determined on the specific use, it's really more of the amount of square footage and generated trips. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be 40 stories of office will or will not trigger it. It just depends on the combination.
Okay, but it could be 40 stories of residential, which
could
that
be.
use impact is different.
It could be, and that's exactly why you want a TIA at site plan, right? We want to be able to say this is a more precise measurement of the impacts, so you get a more precise fix or to mitigate those impacts.
Okay. Councilman Buffkin, you have any? It's your
Yeah.
home district.
Well, I'm interested in the draft condition 9 and the timing of dedicating of affordable housing units. The reason I'm asking is, maybe it's obvious, I don't know, but the 10-year period shall commence from the date a unit is dedicated to be affordable. And I see in the preceding sentence, dedication has to occur prior to issuance certificate of occupancy. We just don't see a lot of these, and I'm not clear as in the development process when this dedication happens. Can you clear that up?
Sure, I can try to, and we modeled this after the earlier case that was approved in the Midtown area that had almost identical language, and so I don't know if the city attorney would care to elaborate on any of those types of discussions, because I don't want to, I'm sure there was a lot of discussion that went into that, but essentially it would make sure that after each 10th unit, you're dedicating it so that you're not getting too far ahead of yourself in building without making sure that dedication is occurring. Of course, if you're building 100 at a time, for example, then you'd have to kind of make sure you're doing that all at the same time. But it allows for kind of that incremental recording, just depending on how quickly you're building.
Would it be after every 9th unit? Because the 10th unit would be 10%.
Prior to the certificate of occupancy for every 10th unit.
And this is just for staff. We've done, I think, one major case since rezoning, since approval of the Midtown Small Area Plan, Walkable Midtown Plan, and that was that one on Navajo Drive. And it got approved with the required or recommended affordable housing, and this is the same condition. Is that right?
Yes, this
We
is
just lifted
modeled
it from that case.
And I would just say that I think the big thing is the trigger after that number of units. And so whenever that's going to be the timing question, I think, is when you get to 2,521, and at that point you're getting 1 per 10 going forward. And when we come back, I have a couple comments about condition 10 I just wanted to raise while we're here as well. Do you want me to go ahead and do that?
If you could.
Yeah, I don't think that the way it's written, it is really saying what the applicant is saying. I think that just saying it's calculated at site plan needs to be clarified. Maybe we can work on that. I'm hearing you say every time a new one comes in, perhaps, but given that how long that this is going to have to be in effect and be interpreted again and again through each site plan, I think we need to be real specific like we were in the other conditions to make sure that someone knows what they are doing when they pick it up when each site plan comes in.
We're more than happy to work with you on that.
And one second. And is it based on new buildings from what day? Or is it, when you say buildings, is it just the buildings within the node, or is it buildings on the property?
It's buildings within the node because that's where most of the concern on the height. That's the only area that's designated for 40 stories that has that intensity right there without any kind of step downs. So it's focused on the Six Forks plan, and the math can be done a number of different ways depending on how many buildings go into each site plan. But we will of course work with the city attorney's office on that, make sure it's clear.
Yeah, please, that needs to be definitely clear. I'm still trying to get around 37.5, but go ahead.
So I think two things. What I have heard the most, I think what we've heard the most about this case is traffic concerns and then concerns for affordable housing. Affordable housing is different based on need. There's an 80% affordable, 80% AMI, 60 all the way down to 30, and the need is different. But this was a plan that was negotiated by the community. It sounds like Councilmember Buffkin was involved. There was wide consensus on it. And what the community said is 80% AMI for 10 years. And so I want to be clear that the condition that's being offered is what the community asked for during this process and what has already been applied to another rezoning case. So you've copied and pasted that into this.
That was our intent, and that is my understanding.
And then on the traffic piece, to piggyback on Councilmember Branch's comment, I think it needs to be clear to the community, because they don't always understand, that there's going to be a required traffic impact analysis before you're ever able to put a crane up or a shovel in the ground. And that may also further limit the height, because if you cannot deliver the level of service, then you're not going to be able to build as much. And so I don't know if that needs to go in a condition or if that needs to be made clear, but we had a discussion at the council table about a traffic analysis being premature at the rezoning stage, but it's definitely going to be required before anything's allowed to be built. And so I don't know, can that be a condition?
It's in the UDO already.
Okay, so it's not going to be a condition, but I think that is important for the community to hear, that if you cannot deliver, if your product going to make traffic worse, you're not going to be able to build it anyway, and that's going to be required before you ever get a permit to start.
Correct.
And I think folks need to understand that, and I don't know if it doesn't sound like there's a way to condition it. It's just going to be required anyway.
I'll let Michael Moore explain that, but that's that part of the site plan process.
Right. It is a condition of the UDO that we would look at the TIA at that time when they have a very specific proposal. We know what a specific mix of office, residential, retail, institutional. We have a very specific mix to look at that point in time. We can put trip generation numbers to that, and then we can see if the infrastructure on the ground at that time is sufficient to handle it. If it is not, then there'll be requirements to mitigate that impact. And if they can't, then we could talk about reducing the intensity of the use to meet those standards of operations.
And I think it's interesting that you noted the intensity of the use, not necessarily the intensity of the height, because as we've learned, the height in a mixed-use development does not necessarily mean increased traffic, right? Like it's the intensity of the use. And if you want to, if I've gotten that wrong, please correct me.
No, it is based upon use, and again, the intensity of the use. I'll give you an example. I can build a 10-story building, and if I do, 10 units, very high-end luxury kind of flats that's got one intensity of use. But if I do 10 stories and I make that all office, and I make it a call center, for example, that's another different kind of intensity of use to that. So to try to provide an illustrative example, I mean, very different traffic generations that come of those two particular scenarios.
Thank you.
You have a question? From what I'm gathering, what I'm hearing, and council members, please correct me if I'm wrong, really just fine-tuning the affordable housing piece and meeting the agreed-upon plan from Midtown, I think is key. And this part could just be me. The height, I know you're saying the high average. I think just saying a number would be good, because if your tallest building is 40 stories, then in order for you, your next building to be close or anything, you're going to be below 35, probably around 35, in order to get to that height. And I don't want to see our engineers out there doing trigonometry to determine the if you violated the code as far as your height, trying to find a tangent, to make it work. So I think picking a number works than just an average. That would help me. Can't speak for the rest of them, but that would help me. And I think other than that, I think you've kind of addressed a lot of the concerns. I think the TIA, which must be done, is key. And I know that was the biggest concern from the community in dealing with that traffic. And then one thing I know, dealing with Lassiter Mills, the traffic, you have to do a TIA, you have to do the design to get traffic, make it make sense. But also just looking at that traffic and the less traffic that we can have that have a negative impact on Lassiter Mills, people going towards Glenwood and redirecting that, for me, I think will be extremely helpful. But those are my comments. Any other?
On this average building height, I hear you, and I appreciate those comments. I'm going to claim some responsibility for this because
It's your fault.
I will claim some. I'll claim a share. So here's how it went. They've heard us. They know folks are really concerned and upset about the 40 stories, and it has been an irritation this entire 2.5, 3 years that we've got a big jump, at least traditionally with our 20-story and 40-story height designations, and 40 scares a lot of people and causes a lot of concern. I took that to concern to them. They said they needed flexibility depending on how the market, tell me if I'm wrong, but basically they wanted flexibility as the market developed. And I said, well, this averaging might be a way to more dynamically deal with the height issue as things develop. So I will claim some responsibility for that, but if a hard number makes you feel better, then I think we should have that conversation. If the average seems more of an artful approach, then we can have that conversation. But that I think is fair, how it got in there, or at least how the conversation went.
That's accurate. Thank you. And just keep in mind, one thing the averaging does is allow the city more flexibility to build a 40-story tower with the transit center incorporated if it so chooses, if that's how this ends up being developed. If we pick a cap, then that would also cap whatever development that the transit center would go into for the city's part. So that's just something to consider.
Okay. Go ahead.
I am sensitive to something that Councilmember Buffkin brought up, which is that we have heard a lot of concern about this concern over how many 40 stories we've been approving. And I want to say something, as my time here is limited. And I can say something, which is 40 stories is arbitrary. It's quite arbitrary in our city. And all we need to do is look as far as Charlotte and their downtown, and they are approving 60 stories. And so if we're concerned with 40 stories, there's another way to skin a cat, which is to say if we're concerned with 40 stories here, we could just start approving 60 stories in downtown. I know we're not going to start doing that, but it's just another way to start looking at things. I'm just going to throw it out there for perspective, and I'm sure that'll be the quote tomorrow. But I think we need to look at things a little bit differently sometimes. Maybe we shouldn't be scared of 40 stories buildings when it's just an arbitrary number that at some point in time we put into our code. So I just want to put that in there for the record, Mr. Clerk. Thank you.
No, that's a good point. Or maybe we just not say a height limit and let them come and tell us how tall it's going to be, and we either vote it up or down. That's an idea I had ran by staff a long time ago. But I think we've given direction. I think on where we are with this. Just to give you an idea, I just did quick math. If you did a 40-story, 38, and a 35, those three heights, and you divide by 3, it's 37.6. So, and that's 3 buildings right there. So I know footprint can only allow you to do but so much, and I get that. So I'll let you all figure out the best approach. I think, like I said, we've given direction on that, and we also had the other item that we had before us too on the assemblage that we need to recommend back out to council. If anyone has a motion or something as far as us having given direction to the applicant and staff on how to move forward with these 2 items.
I'll suggest we report it out, but because the conditions are still being discussed, still developed, still need staff review, that we report it out with no recommended action at this point. We see what signed conditions come in. I know there'll be more conversation. I know more people will be in touch with me, and conversations will go on. We've got a few weeks before we reach a decision point. Along the way, we'll get the signed conditions or not, and we'll see what form they're in, and then it'll be with the council. And I think it's about time to bring this to a decision.
Okay.
And then what do you want to do about the Six Forks Road improvements, the prior item?
Well, Mr. Branch asked to hold that until we finish this, so I think we're going to return to that.
Yeah, we'll go.
Got it.
Yeah,
Sorry, so do them separate.
Yeah, let's just do them separate. Make it clean. So was that your motion?
That is my motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and properly second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed have the same right. Motion carries unanimously. The other item, I think, was more or less, I think, information.
Yes, sir. It was provided for information.
Because Councilmember Buffkin did want to send some recommendation to council that we
Consider.
recommend prioritizing those 2 sections in any future transportation bond.
Yeah, and I'll acknowledge it's a little bit awkward, again, because some future council is going to have to deal with this.
Right.
It's
Just a recommendation.
it is a recommendation. I think it would be good if that happened, but I won't be around to finish this.
So could your motion be something where you give a recommendation to consider?
Yeah, a recommendation to consider for high priority, the Six Forks Phase 2 in the next transportation bond, whenever that might be.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and properly second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right, motion carries unanimously. Thank you all. We have one pending item left in committee. It's about Borland Heights parking concerns. We're going to actually just hold that until the community comes back, until we come back in, I guess, in January, whomever's on the committee. We could send it to staff if that's the motion, but we had it pending, so we did not, because we did not, I guess, reference it, we probably can't act on it. Is that right?
Are you talking about sending it?
The Borland Heights parking, just send it to staff and,
I think you can do that and let it come back here and then report it out.
okay,
Staff is already doing some work on that. So.
okay. So it's already with staff, so we'll just let it sit until this body meets at some future date. All right. The other thing I want to mention for the North Hills piece, I believe any conditions to be put in for council to consider for the 15th of November have to be in by November 4th. So just want to make sure everyone is aware of that. Of course, they cannot be considered by this coming Tuesday when we see each other to report out because that deadline has passed. But November 4th is when any signed conditions have to be submitted in order for council to consider at the next meeting, which will be November 15th. With that said, nothing else, all hearts and minds. I am closing the last Transit and Transportation Committee meeting in the year of 2022 because I will not be available for us to have a meeting in November, and we will see what happens in December. We are adjourned.